Good morning. Do you love that line? Once your enemy, now seated at your table. The gift of hospitality. When I was going to college, between my junior and senior years, I came down to Billings to do an internship out at Exxon. And even though I'd been raised in the church and I knew all about things of the Bible, I don't believe at that time I was saved. I had the knowledge, but I did not yet really know the love of God. And one day when I was at work, I went into an office of another engineer named Rex, and I looked over his shoulder and I saw that during the lunch hour he was reading his Bible. I thought, oh my goodness, he's a religious fanatic. And I tiptoed backwards out of the office. And so suddenly he was in my mind to being some kind of an unusual person. And a few days later, I was chatting with him, and during the conversation, he yawned, a big, big yawn. And I just jokingly said something like, "So were you out partying last night?" And he said, "No, we just had our first baby, and when my wife, Mary, gets up to nurse the baby, I get up and read the Bible to her." That hit me. I just thought that was so amazing to think of him getting up at night while his wife was nursing their baby and just being with her. It wasn't so much reading the Bible as being with her. And I was about 22 years old at that time, and I really wanted to be married someday. I thought it looked like a wonderful, wonderful arrangement, and it just struck me, that's the kind of relationship I want to have someday. And I graduated from college, went off to California, worked for a few years down there as an engineer, came back to Montana, went to law school, and eventually 7 years later, I ended up back in Billings. And there was a person working down at the federal building where I was working named Rich. And one day, and I'd been, by the way, attending a church here in town for about a year. And it was a good church. I enjoyed the preaching. I enjoyed the Sunday school class. But in the 12 months I attended there, I was never once invited into anyone's home. Just a new single guy back from college here, and not one person. They were friendly at church and talked to me there, but nobody reached out and said, "Hey, would you like to come home for a meal?" And one day, a friend, a coworker at work, invited me just to come to his church. And my theology had been shifting a bit. And I was looking at some other theological perspectives, and I learned that this church might be a better alignment, this other church. So I went and visited that church. And afterwards, Rich invited me home for a meal. First time I was at the church, I was invited home for a meal. And lo and behold, Rex, the guy who 7 years earlier had gotten up at night to be with his wife, was there as well. He was an elder in the church. And it was just delightful conversation, very simple meal. It was tomato soup and grilled cheese sandwiches. And I loved it. It was so simple, so basic. It was so real. And after the meal, Rich and Rex and I were sitting in the living room, and I said, "Rex, there's something I've got to tell you. You probably don't even remember this, but 7 years ago when I interned down at Exxon, one day you yawned and I kidded you about being out, and you told me that you had actually been up that night with your wife as she was nursing your baby." I said, "That really had an impact on me. It planted a seed that God nurtured over the next several years, and I eventually came to Christ." It was because of several encounters like that, of seeing people living out their faith and having extraordinary relationships. And that was one of the first that really struck me, that there's something different about those who seriously, sincerely follow Christ. And I want to thank you for your example. And at that point, his wife, Mary, who'd been in the kitchen, who'd overheard our conversation, poked her head out and said, "Rexy, when did you ever get up with me when I was nursing a baby?" And with a sheepish look on his face, he said, "Well, that first night." So as it turned out, in God's providence, there was only one time that he did this extraordinary thing. And I happened to see him yawn the next day. Now, I believe that was providentially, sovereignly arranged. But what really struck me as we all laughed about that, I thought, these are real people. They're not perfect. Even their elders have their foibles and their weaknesses. And I felt comfortable with them. I didn't feel like I had to put on a mask and pretend to be this perfect Christian. I could be real. And I didn't feel they had to make a big production to have me into their home. It was just a very natural, easy thing to do. And I was invited back into that home many more times into Rex and Mirabee's home. And I eventually made that home my church home. And it's where I grew tremendously in my faith. Tremendously. And it was because I experienced the magnetic power of hospitality. It was magnetic. Let's talk about this phenomenal ministry. And Pastor Rick has alluded to this. He mentioned this in a recent sermon in Acts 2:42 through 47. And I'm going to pick up on something that he pointed out. Let's read that passage here first. We've been looking at this for the last several weeks. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, to the breaking of bread and the prayers. And awe came over every soul, and many wonders and signs were being done through the apostles. And all who believed were together and had all things in common. And they were selling their possessions and belongings and distributing the proceeds to all, as any had need. And day by day, attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, they received their food with glad and generous hearts, praising God and having favor with all the people. And the Lord added to their number daily, those who were being saved. Now, as Pastor Rick said in a sermon, I think it was just last week, there are two kinds of table fellowship described in this passage. There's formal and informal. There is a communing at God's table through Holy Communion as we gather together on Sunday, but there's also a gathering together in informal ways in our own homes. And today what I want to talk about is the informal, magnetic hospitality that each of us can practice at any time in our own homes. I'm going to have 4 key points here today. Number 1, what is the biblical basis for hospitality? Number 2, what are some of the barriers to hospitality? Why don't we do it? Number 3, how do we overcome those barriers and actually make hospitality one of the most enjoyable and rewarding aspects of our life? And then finally, who can you focus on? Who can you make the object of your hospitality? So let's start off with the biblical basis. It is difficult, I can't quite yet say impossible because I haven't read everything this carefully, but it is difficult to find a book in the Bible that does not somehow, some way mention the ministry of hospitality. Words like feast and banquet and meal, hospitality itself are mentioned over 200 times in the Bible in various forms. It's all over the place. It's everywhere. It predominantly, when you look at this ministry of hospitality, it predominantly involves food and drink, coming together for nourishment, sharing food and drink together. But in many cases, it also involves giving people a place of rest, a place of safety, a place to sleep, even a place to live for a season. That's the ultimate form of hospitality. Come in and live in my home with me. Many examples in the Old Testament. In Genesis 18, where God and 2 other angels come down and they pay a visit to Abraham and Sarah. And what's the first thing Abraham does? He says, "Give me a minute, I'm going to make a meal for you." And he immediately moves to find a way to prepare some food for these visitors. It's the first thing on his mind. Hospitality, preparing something to nourish the people who are visiting him. Genesis 43, where Joseph's brothers come back the second time to Egypt, Joseph doesn't just receive them and chat with them. He has a meal, an elegant meal prepared for them. And he brings them in and sits them in his own home and feeds them this welcoming, warm, and lavish meal. In the Old Testament, hospitality frequently is used to save lives. Not just to give comfort, but to literally save lives. You think in 1 Samuel 25, the story of Abigail, her husband Naaman, who offended David, and David's coming out of the hills to wipe out all the men, not just Naaman, but all the men on the farm. A massacre, a bloody massacre of dozens of people, which would have destroyed David's reputation with the people, perhaps disqualified him forever for the kingship. And it's a woman who comes out with food, hospitality, who turns the tide, softens his heart, actually brings him to repentance, where he ends up praising God for her wisdom and her grace, and said, if you'd not come here today, not a man would be left on your farm. Praise be to God for your wisdom. The story of Esther. The king is planning to massacre the Jews, and Esther plans some banquets, some feasts, some meals for the king to soften his heart, to prepare him for her appeal. You even see in 1 Kings 17, there's a drought and a famine all over Israel. Elijah is afraid that he's going to starve to death, and God says, no, I've made provision. Go to Zarephath. There's a woman there, and she'll feed you for 3 years. She was so poor, she only had enough food for one more meal in her house. One more meal when he came knocking at the door. And yet she did not deny him that meal. She said, I'll prepare a meal for you, and then we'll lay down and we'll die. And instead, God providentially increased her store that day after day, her little flask of oil and the little container of grain was replenished for 1,000 days as she ministered this gift of hospitality. Hospitality can save lives. Now in the New Testament, the greatest proponent of hospitality, guess who? The right answer is always Jesus. It is Jesus. We see this again and again. Matthew 9:9. Jesus calls Matthew, the tax collector, the outcast, the scorned one, to follow him. And what's the first thing Jesus does? Let's have a meal. They sit down and have a meal. And they invite other tax collectors and other people that aren't respected in the community to that meal. Matthew 22, just one of the many places, Jesus uses a feast, a banquet, as the basis for a parable. It's a wedding feast and the king inviting people. Significant event, major event. Everyone wants to be there. And he uses that as a picture of us being invited into the kingdom, into the family of God. In Matthew 25:35, Jesus is talking about the end times, judgment in the end times. And he says, for I was hungry and you gave me food, and I was thirsty and you gave me drink. Truly I say to you, as you did it for one of the least of these brothers, you did it for me. When you practice hospitality, when you bring people into your home and feed them out of whatever limited means you have, you're actually feeding the Lord if you're doing it out of love for him. Luke 10:40, one of the most explicit stories of hospitality. Mary and Martha, noted for their hospitality, 2,000 years later, we're still reading about it. And yet it's also a place where Jesus teaches about some of the stumbling blocks to hospitality, some that I think we can relate to. We'll talk about those in a moment. Think of the picture of Holy Communion, being invited every week to a table to dine with the Lord, to dine on the Lord. His body, his blood, shed and broken for us, and we're invited to his table to remember that, to celebrate that, to receive the grace of communion. And even as we look ahead to the ultimate end of this world, Jesus in John 14 talks about that he's going to his Father's house where there are many rooms prepared for us. This is where it's not only food and drink, but it is to live with him forever. The writer of Revelations picks this up in chapter 19, and he talks about the culmination, the climax of our salvation is the marriage feast of the Lamb. It's a powerful metaphor. It's all over the place in the Bible. If you look at the New Testament epistles, the apostles pick up this theme as well. And hospitality is actually repeatedly commanded. Not suggested, commanded. Romans 12:13, Paul says, I pray that you would contribute to the needs of the saints and seek to show hospitality. The writer of Hebrews in chapter 13 says, let brotherly love continue. Do not neglect to show hospitality to your best buds. No, to strangers. To show hospitality even to strangers. For thereby some have entertained angels unawares. Peter picks up this theme in his first letter. Above all, keep loving one another earnestly, since love covers over a multitude of sins. Show hospitality to one another without grumbling. In other words, hospitality is not an optional ministry. It's one that God calls every one of us to practice. And particularly, it's interesting in 1 Timothy 3 and also in Titus 1, God, through the Holy Spirit, working through the writers, indicates that hospitality is one of the specific qualifications for leadership in the church. If a person is not exercising this gift of hospitality, he is not meeting one of the specific requirements for an elder. Now, why is there such a strong emphasis on this? Why does the Bible speak so much on this? Why do we mark our special holidays and gatherings with others with meals? We don't just say, come over to the house. We say, come over for Thanksgiving dinner. Come over for dinner Friday night. Come over for this kind of meal, this kind of meal. We gather around food. We gather around food. Now, and even when you think about going out on a date, if a guy just asked the young lady out to a movie and that's all, she'd think, not very impressive. But when he says, I'll pick you up at 5:30 and take you to a nice dinner and then we'll go to a movie, might be some potential here. Why is it? Well, shared meals provide a double blessing. They nourish our body, to be sure. We need that. We need to be nourished every day. Food and fluids to just keep our body going. But there's more than that. They nourish the heart. They nourish relationships. They nourish friendships as we gather together. And God has actually built some of this into our physiology. When you have a nice, good meal and you are full, your body, your brain is going to send a signal to release serotonin and melatonin. This is why afternoon of Thanksgiving, everybody wants to lay down and take a nap, because your body is just flooded with melatonin and serotonin. But when you have company, you can't really lay down and take a nap. You need to stay awake. But what happens is you are actually very relaxed. You're happy. You're pleasant. You're amiable after you've had a nice meal. And you enjoy talking with other people, listening to them, making friends, connecting. Food does that to us. Food does that to us. Now, if hospitality is such a wonderful thing, even a required aspect of our life, why don't we do it more? Why don't we do it more? Well, I looked at my own life, and I found a lot of the reasons there. Number one, we just say we're so busy. We're just so busy. We just don't have time. And that's true. We are very busy. But I think many of us will look back someday and say, if I could do it all over again, I would have dialed down my busyness and I would have spent more time with people. Sometimes we think we're too poor. We just don't have the money to bring people in and put on a really nice meal. Okay, well, the widow of Zarephath could have thought that. She had enough for one more meal, and yet she was willing to share it. And she trusted that somehow God would provide. So we may not be able to entertain someone every week, but most of us could squeeze out enough for some tomato soup and a loaf of bread and some cheese and grilled cheese and tomato soup. Maybe you can give up a latte once or twice a week. That would more than cover the cost of a simple meal. There may be dietary concerns. Either we may have some limitations, some food allergies, or we're afraid that we may invite someone who does and it'll make it awkward for them. And that's a legitimate concern, something we need to be sensitive to. It's not something we should let us stop us in this ministry, but we need to be sensitive as we carry this ministry out. Sometimes it's just privacy. Maybe you're like me. I'm an introvert. My happy place is a cabin in the mountains with my wife and my dog, and no one else. But I'm learning to really enjoy other people. And even though I still cherish the times where I'm there with my wife and my dog, I'm learning to enjoy other people by doing some things I'll talk about in just a moment on how to come out of being an introvert and learning to love, learning to care, learning to engage. Sometimes it's a fear of weak conversation. That was a biggie for me, is that I'd have a hard time, these are strangers sitting at my table. What do I say? And I learned that the thing that really made it difficult for me was superficial conversation. Like, so how long have you been in Billings? 3 years. Where'd you come from? Seattle. And we ask these questions that allow, 3-syllable answers, and we have another question right away. So we need to learn to ask different questions where we get sentences and paragraphs in return. I'd say most of all for me, and I think many of us, it's what I would call the Martha complex. Martha was the one who was upset. Jesus was there with his disciples, this whole big group of people in her home. She was frantically out in the kitchen, cooking, doing dishes, trying to clean things up, everything else. Her sister Mary is sitting there just at Jesus' feet listening to him teach. And Martha goes and she basically rebukes Jesus implicitly. Look what you're doing here. You're allowing this to happen. She's unhappy with her sister, to be sure, but there's an implicit even rebuke of Jesus. Jesus said, Mary's chosen what is best. Dirty dishes are not going to make a big difference. But we have pride. Sometimes it comes up. We may think our house is not clean enough. This is one of the areas I always try to encourage my wife, that anytime we're going to entertain, it's like she's got to clean the whole house from top to bottom. And what I keep saying is, honey, if you do that, the couple that comes in, the woman who's going to come in, is not going to be able to relate to you, because this is not what her house looks like. She'll be more comfortable in a messy house, actually. We may be concerned that our children will misbehave. Oh goodness, if these people come and our kids act up and fight at the table, we're going to be embarrassed. We basically are more concerned about impressing people than we are about really just loving them, encouraging them. None of these excuses is a good enough one to override the explicit biblical commands to practice hospitality. So, how do we overcome them? Well, if Jesus is the answer to most questions in the Bible, the gospel is the answer to the rest of them. And that's really how we overcome these, is by focusing on the gospel, delighting in the gospel, remembering the gospel, letting it shape us, prune us, refine us. It's the motive, it's the model, it's the method for all of life, and specifically for hospitality. The line in that last song we sang a few minutes ago, once your enemy, now seated at your table. That's staggering. The king we offended, the king we rebelled against, the king we were enemies of, has not only forgiven us and said, okay, you're forgiven, take off. He says, forgiven, come in to my home, to my heart, to my relationship. Jesus says he calls us his friends, his brothers, his sisters. God tells us that he adopts us into his family, children, sons and daughters of God. He brings us not only into his house, but into his heart. And the Bible calls us to be imitators of God. I think one of the main reasons we fail to do hospitality is we don't dwell enough on the amazing hospitality of God. This gift that he has given to us in his fellowship and his friendship and nourishing us and providing for us and engaging us and sharing his heart with us, speaking to us, listening to us, all of the manifestations of relationship and fellowship. as the love of God is channeled through us in the ministry of hospitality, it impacts other people. That last line we read a minute ago, verse 47, said that the Lord added to their number daily those who were being saved, because they were coming together and not only worshiping together, sitting under good teaching together, enjoying the Lord's table together, but actually gathering in their homes as well. Let me give you an analogy. If you have a magnet, if I had a magnet sitting up here on the podium over here, and I had a paper clip over here, they would just sit there forever and never come together. Something either has to move them together or something has to come between them. If I put a small iron rod between the magnet and the paper clip, chung, the paper clip would attach itself to the metal rod. The metal rod itself is not magnetized, but when it comes in contact with a powerful magnet, what happens is all these little miniature, they call them magnetic domains in the iron, but they're all random, and so they cancel each other out until they touch a large magnet. And then suddenly that magnetic force aligns those magnetic domains and makes the piece of metal itself magnetic. Bing! The paper clip attaches because of the magnetic power coming through that little iron rod. And that's what we are. God is the magnetic power. The gospel, the love of God is over here. Many people are a long ways away from him. Okay? And God is calling us to be that intermediary, to let his power, his grace, realign our priorities until they line up with his, and it draws people in the way that meal many years ago drew me to a particular church, drew me to Christ himself. We can be that magnetic power of God's gospel love as he works through us. And in doing so, we can not only attach people to ourselves initially. People would just say, wow, it was really nice being at the Smiths home. It just felt so friendly and warm. And it might attach them even more to our church and say, that's a church I want to come back to. They're friendly, there's fellowship, there's relationship there. But ultimately, and more importantly, to have people be attached, magnetically attached to God through Christ. So how can we overcome these barriers? What are some practical things we can do to overcome the barriers and actually make hospitality a fulfilling, rewarding ministry? Well, number one, the simpler the better. The simpler the better. Don't make it a big fancy meal. That's going to be a big hurdle for you to get over, and frankly, it'll make people a little bit uncomfortable. Oh, you went to so much trouble. I hate to see you go to this much trouble. I've said it 3 times already. I'll say it again. Grilled cheese and tomato soup, or whatever your equivalent simple, easy meal is. It makes people feel relaxed. It makes people feel like they're just coming into your home and being part of your family. No big production. They're one of you. Be like the widow of Zarephath. She had a little jar of oil and some grain, and she made a feast for Elijah. Be prepared for dietary concerns. I was talking to Corlette about this weekend, and we were just chatting about, what are some meals that are safe for people? There's a lot of food allergies today. We've got a lot more tests now, and people actually find out that they're allergic to things. And I'm not an expert on this. My wife is the cook in our household. I contribute an appetite. But she was telling me just some of the things that she tries to do, but I'd like to make a request of you. For those of you who have got food allergies, would you please be so kind to send an email to my wife, Corlette, or to me? We'd like to put together a memo, just a short little memo saying these are some things you can do to deal with food allergies and be sensitive to different options and different ways that people can eat in your home. And you can always have some very simple, basic food there, salad making, some hamburgers, some things that are generally going to be safe for other people. So I'd like to compile that and make it available to the church so we eliminate that excuse. So it's no longer one we can hide behind. We're already ready for it. I'd like to encourage you to pray that God would make you more of a Mary than a Martha. Now, as I read that passage in Luke, Jesus commends Mary, so far be it from me to critique her, but I will just a little bit. Maybe, we don't know all the details of that, It'd be nice if Mary might have come out to the kitchen and said, Martha, why don't you go out there for a little while and listen to him? He's really great. I'll do the dishes for a few minutes. So we need to have that mixture of, yes, wanting to be in fellowship with God, wanting to attend to people, but there are also dishes and things to set the table, and we can help one another, and we can be attentive to it, but not be obsessed with it. Not be obsessed with it. A little mess is actually a good thing. Seriously. People can relate more to our messes than they can to our spotless, better homes and garden homes. Be real, like Rexa Marabee and Rich and his wife were to me. I was drawn into their home. I felt comfortable in their home. I came back many times, and I never felt like I was being in imposition to them. Practice other awareness when people come into your home. Learn to ask questions that get sentence and paragraph answers instead of just one word or two-word answers. Ask people things like, one of the questions I've shared here before is that there's couples there. I will almost always ask the question, when you first started dating, what was the quality, the character quality you saw in the other person that first made you think this could be the one? I never cease to be amazed at the answer. I always rule out, you can't say she was cute. But you learn to ask questions that draw people out. Questions like, what would you do tomorrow if you knew you could not fail? And if you really want to make a conversation interesting, focus your questions on children. If a family comes into your home with little children, in most cases the kids sit there silently. They've been taught to just be quiet, mind their manners, don't fight, don't spill, and the adults will have the conversation. I don't think that's a great idea. And when people come into my home, if the children are old enough to engage, I will ask 90% of my questions and engage the children more than the adults. And I've never had a parent complain. I've never had a parent say, boy, I felt slighted. The fact is they feel incredibly honored that another adult paid attention to their children, appreciated what they wanted to say, drew them out, helped them to think about some things in their lives. And I love questions like, okay, what would you do tomorrow or this week if your school had to close down, there was a water main pipe, they had to close the school down, and your dad just won a big prize and you had money to take a big trip? Where would you go? And you can just see kids, their eyes get big, go, oh, I'd go to Disneyland, or you'll start getting their dreams. And I've had kids go on for 5 minutes telling this big adventure, and it's funny, it's comical, it's so enjoyable to see kids dream and share from their heart without inhibition. So learn to ask questions. I'm going to be posting this afternoon a blog to our website, the church website, with about 25 questions you can use in those kind of settings with people. And I've found that the more I can ask those questions, the more comfortable it is, the more people like it. I even had one dad call me up just a couple hours after they left our house, and he said, thank you for engaging my children the way you did. No one's ever done that before. So just talk to children, talk to people. Another thing you can do is use your time together to model godly living. If you have someone come into your home, make it a point to model godly living. And in particular, I would just say this to men, for example, honor your spouse. Explicitly commend and praise and honor your wife for the meal, for the hospitality, for other qualities you can talk about in a sincere, natural way. And that the other guy sitting there who maybe has not said a positive word about his wife in public in 10 years suddenly realizes, wow, that's really a neat thing to do, to honor one another. The Bible calls us to honor one another. How much more would our spouse or children or a friend, those closest to us, deserve that? Use the time together to guide conversation, to engage children, to share common struggles, to demonstrate empathy and compassion. One of the reasons that Corlette and I joined this other church I mentioned was because of some godly couples. We saw them interact with each other, we saw them interact with their children, and we said, that's the kind of marriage we want to have, that's the kind of parents we want to be. We want to be around those examples. And they were not perfect people, they were real people, but we really enjoyed them. Another thing you can do is if you can't invite someone into your home at a particular time, consider taking a meal to them. Consider taking a meal to someone else. This last week, my little 18-month-old Granddaughter was in the hospital for 4 days with a very high temperature, high white blood cell count. We didn't know what it was. Might have been appendicitis. They were thinking at one point possibly meningitis. We were really stressed out. As grandparents, you can imagine how my daughter and her husband, the parents, were just stressed out. Megan didn't leave the hospital for 4 days. She slept down there with her daughter. And when they finally got out and the temperature went down, and now it looks like it might have just been a gastrointestinal infection that has gone away, sigh of relief, but also a lot of exhaustion, a lot of physical and emotional exhaustion. So yesterday, Susie Stafford calls up. Calls up my wife and says, I want to bring a meal by. It's been a long week for you, and I want to bring a meal by for your daughter and her family too. They're not even members of this church. Wow. Talk about magnetic power. Seeing a need and delivering a meal. We're good at that, I think, in this church. When there's been a new baby or illness or surgery, we rally around those people, but there's a lot of things in life that can cause some stress that we can be sensitive to. When you do this, when you offer hospitality, I want to encourage you, one warning, do not treat it as a debt. It's a gift. God's gift of the gospel to us is a gift, and we can't pay it back. So the worst thing you can say as you leave someone's house is say, oh, we'll have to have you over sometime. We have to repay this somehow. You've just robbed it from them. I want you instead say, thank you so much for having us into your home. You have no idea how much you refreshed us this week. That blesses people. That encourages them, and it doesn't create this sense of indebtedness. Who should you invite? Well, how about the family sitting next to you? There's a lot of people here who I've not yet had the privilege of having into our home, but I hope steadily over the next few months. Corlette and I are looking forward to doing that. We've enjoyed a lot of you. We want to enjoy all of you. We can start with each other, inviting each other. And you could even call up during the week and just say, hey, Sunday after church, could we have you over for grilled cheese and tomato soup? You know, make it a goal. I'm just going to throw out just a suggestion. Make it a goal once a month. Once a month. Invite someone into your home. And don't let, if you are a single living in a teeny little apartment, don't think, well, I don't even have a big place, I'm single, I can't. Invite another single, someone else, and just say, hey, all we're going to have is grilled cheese and tomato soup. I would have loved that when I was a single college student. I would have loved that. Speaking of college students, there's a lot of them here. And I can tell you most of them don't eat quite as well as they did at home. There's a lot of good cooks in this church. There's a lot of good cooks in this church. I encourage you to open your eyes, see the single people here, whether they're college students or just singles working, and just realize, you know, for fellowship, for nourishment, for hospitality, just reach out. Say, hey, could we have you over? You know, especially, I think, on holidays. I'm really hoping that we can develop a really organized way that no one in this church does not have an invitation into a home on our holidays. I had a time in my life where that was my case, and it was one of the loneliest times of my life. Everybody else is having their Thanksgiving meals, and I was all by myself. I don't want that to happen here. And I'm going to be suggesting something to our deacons on how to organize something to make sure nobody falls between those cracks. What about visitors? You know, people walk in here all the time just visiting this church, and the first time I walked in, I heard the music, I went, wow, and then I heard Jeff's sermon, I went, wow, and I talked to some people who were very friendly, I went, wow, and we came back again, and we became members. But I'll be honest, I would have been glued even more quickly if somebody had said, hey, are you a visitor? Would you like to come home for a meal? And I'm going to also suggest something to the deacons that we try to set up an arrangement that we find somebody in the church who has a gift for people in administration, who is in the foyer, maybe a couple people would do this, and they would identify visitors. I'm not good at that because you might be here for 3 years and I'll still say, hello, my name's Ken. But some people really zero in and they see someone who's new. And I'd love to see the day where they would walk up and say hi. In fact, I mentioned this Rex and Marabee. Marabee was the person at that church that did it. She had a gift for it. And as soon as she identified a visitor couple, she said hello to them. She grabbed one of the elders, brought him over and said, I want you to meet so-and-so. And then she grabbed the designated on-call hospitality family for that Sunday and said, I want you to meet so-and-so. And they said, wonderful, nice to meet you. Would you like to come to our home for a meal? Now, about half the time, the people were sort of blown away by it, and they said, thanks, but we've got some other plan. They just weren't used to it. It sort of surprised them. But they'd been invited. They at least had been invited. And if you're the on-call couple, then you just sort of shift to someone else. There's a backup plan, and you find someone else to have your home that day. I just think a deliberate, real serious effort to reach out and exercise this minute. I'm just going to propose it, just my suggestion. But what about coworkers? There's people some of us work beside every week. Never been into our homes. They don't know us well, but worst of all, they may not know Jesus. He's that magnetic force over here, and they're the paperclip over here. We can be that magnetic, that rod between. Invite our neighbors, invite our coworkers into our home for hospitality. Remember, hospitality has magnetic power. It's how we attach and build relationships. It's how we draw people to ourselves. It's how we draw people to our church. It's how we make them feel connected and loved and safe and involved. But there's a bonus. There's a great bonus to exercising hospitality. Remember my analogy? You've got a magnet on one side of the podium, you've got a paper clip over here, and you've got an iron rod you put in between them. That iron rod is not magnetic. All the magnetic domains are randomly organized, but when it touches a big magnet, it becomes magnetic. But guess what? If you leave that iron rod in contact with that powerful magnet for very long, you know what happens? Those magnetic domains get aligned in the same direction permanently. Permanently. The rod becomes magnetic. And that is God's vision for us. That his love would be in us so powerfully that anybody who comes close to us, not just at church, but anywhere, his magnetic power has permanently realigned our priorities, permanently realigned our hearts, so that his love, his compassion, his empathy is always working through us. Folks, that's the formula for good friendships. That's the formula for lasting marriages. It's the formula for great parent-child relationships. It's the formula for being the kind of people and the kind of church where we could say and rejoice, the Lord is adding daily to our numbers those who are being saved. Let's pray.